Hello, if you are hearing us, we will begin this session in just a few minutes. Thanks for connecting. Hello, good afternoon. Thank you for connecting to this virtual seminar on the variants of the SARS-CoV-2 virus in the region of the Americas for journalists. I'm from the Communication Department of the Pan American Health Organization, and we have organized this session to offer you the knowledge we have right now regarding the variants, because we feel that this may help inform and to send the best information based on science to your audiences. At PAHO, we recognize the key role that journalists play and all communicators who count on a platform to communicate when informing the population regarding this pandemic. So we thank you very much for connecting to this session, and we hope this will be useful. In today's session, we have Dr. Silvan Alighieri, Assistant Director of the Emergencies Department and Incidents Manager for COVID-19 at PAHO, as well as Dr. Jairo Mendez Rico, a virologist and advisor on viral diseases, emerging viral diseases at PAHO, as well as Fernando Mota, an investigator from the Osvaldo Cruz Fiocruz Foundation in Brazil. Fiocruz is one of the reference laboratories of the regional surveillance Genomic Regional Surveillance Network coordinated by PAHO. After the presentations that we'll hear this afternoon from our panelists, we'll have time for questions and answers. We have already received several questions via email. You can also send us questions through the chat or the Q&A. We also have simultaneous interpretation into English and Spanish, so you can also choose to select your language through the interpretation button. I'd like to invite Dr. Alighieri to share a few words with us in the opening session of this seminar today. Dr. Alighieri? Thank you, Sebastian, and good afternoon to all of you, journalists and colleagues who are connected. It's really a session focused on exchanging ideas with journalists in the countries. The genomic surveillance of SARS-CoV-2, the genomic surveillance in general, is something which could be considered complicated. And it is at the center of many reports at this time. So it is important to support each other based on science, because that's important. And that's why we've asked our leader of the viral genomic surveillance leader, Dr. Jairo Mendez Rico, and a specialist from one of the reference centers in the region, from the Osvaldo Cruz Foundation, Dr. Fernando Mota, to share with us some ideas which are key and basic so that you can prepare knowledgeable reports and articles. The work at PAHO at this time, and since January of 2020, has been to support the countries in their response against COVID-19. There's a series of 10 response pillars, including the surveillance one, the epidemiologic surveillance pillar, which has the laboratory surveillance aspect, as well as a vaccine response pillar, and one of clinical management. What we'd like to give you is a general overview at this time of how you link the genomic surveillance and genetic aspects of the virus with the surveillance of the efficacy of the vaccines that are being used, as well as the clinical patterns patients have in the health services. These are all very complex issues. And there are certain aspects that we know. There are other aspects that we're just learning about every single day. And there are other aspects we don't know yet. So we're working in a sphere where there's a lot of uncertainty. And I think that the best approach to be able to work and to live with these uncertainties is to group all brains together, to get the brains and the experts together. And we're working on in networks to support the countries who have the capacity to do the virus sequencing for SARS-CoV-2. There's an existing capacity in the region, which has existed for over 10 years. The virology laboratories have been doing sequencing of viruses or bacteria. It began with cholera during the year 2000, but and then it followed with the chikungunya virus and the Zika, the yellow fever virus, the influenza viruses, which are many, including SARS-CoV-2, which is the COVID-19 agent. So our objective is to support the countries who have that capacity and maybe even raise that capacity, and also support the countries that do not have options in the short or medium term to develop the sequencing capacity so that they can access the existing capacities in other countries, neighboring countries or countries from other subregions in the Americas. And as we've done since the existence of the Pan American Health Organization, we do that under the Pan American spirit. So the foundation in Brazil was one of the laboratories that beginning last year was a reference laboratory serving to support other countries in South America and Central America, as well as in the Caribbean. And in just a short amount of time, we've been able to expand the work of two laboratories, the Public Health Institute in Chile, as well as the Osvaldo Cruz Foundation in Fiocruz in Brazil. We have 6 reference laboratories in the Americas, and we have new candidates coming up to support the countries. We are now counting on the disease control centers of the United States in Atlanta and the participation of the Linderey in Mexico, as well as the participation of the Gorgas Institute in Panama, and the participation of the West Indies organization, the University of West Indies, in their campus in Trinidad and Tobago. So our sphere, our idea is to work in networks. Our idea is to provide information and combine the information with the epidemiologists so that we can follow the trends and the dynamic of the outbreaks, work hand in hand with the clinicians to detect changes in severity or clinical patterns in patients, above all the severely ill patients who are in our ICU centers at this time, as well as supporting the vaccination campaigns in the countries in aspects of vaccine efficacy, as well as the escape of these vaccines, if that escape were to exist. I'm going to stop here at this time, and I'm going to give the floor back to Sebastian Oliel to continue with the session. Thank you, Doctor. Very interesting what you tell us about the history of the sequencing, which began with the cholera and has now advanced to the surveillance network. But to continue with our seminar, I'm going to now give the floor to Jairo Mendez Rico. As I said, he's the advisor in emerging viral diseases at PAHO, and he's going to talk to us about the general aspects of the variants and the regional situation. Jairo, good afternoon. You have the floor. Thank you very much, Sebastian, and good afternoon to all of you. It is a pleasure not only to be here with you and with all our journalist colleagues today. As Dr. Sivan said, it's definitely a process that has generated a great deal of concern in recent months, the question of these variants, and we'd like to be able to work this with you from the point of view of the basis of where this question of foundations comes from. And of course, it's a pleasure to have my colleague and friend, Dr. Fernando Mote, with whom we've worked considerably on all these topics here with us today. As I said, I'm only going to give you a general overview, a very generic overview, and tell you a bit of what are the biological bases in a very simple way, and what has led us to know what we have today with these variants, and that is that it's not something new. It's not something we didn't expect. So I always like to begin by saying something which is very important, and that is that what we always hear when we talk about mutations and processes like these is that these are natural events. These are expected events that we know and knew would happen because most viruses use this process and these mutations and changes as an evolution and adaptation process to the environment where they're growing. In fact, usually these viruses, those that are made up of a nucleic acid molecule, which you've heard repeatedly is the RNA, is the type of virus that has certain characteristics which are more prone to generate these mutations and therefore to generate genetic variations. There are different types of mutations. Some are more important than others. But just to give you in context, in a very simple way, what is a mutation? We sometimes, when we hear the word mutation, think of monsters and terrible things. But the truth is that a mutation is nothing more than a change. It's just a biological, chemical change, which in fact is much more frequent than we even know and tends to occur at a molecular, in the genetic material of an individual, in this case of the virus. To give you an example here, we can presume that this genetic code could be that of a virus or of anything. And as it replicates and the genetic material evolves, certain changes are introduced, as you see here with the extra colors. And based on this, other changes occur and so on and so forth. You can accumulate changes like these, which at times are changes which occur are at the level of the genetic material and can be seen reflected in the viral protein. They can be reflected in the viral structure. And basically, that's what a mutation actually is. And as I was saying, there are different types of mutations. At what time do the variants begin to appear and these genetic groups and all these different names that we hear so much and have complicated things so much? And if we go to other terms, we see the following. Let us imagine that this is the genetic material, the original genetic material of the original virus. And let's say that this is the original virus of Wuhan when it began to be transmitted. For a time, it was transmitted and remained the same. After some time, after a long transmission and a long number of replications, it began to generate certain mutations and changes. These changes then began to group together. Some began to show the same characteristics, the same changes, and thus we began to speak of different genetic groups that shared, that were divided, in other words, and began to show changes and some of these mutations. After that, these groups, especially at a geographic level, begin to evolve within a geographic area and from there generate additional changes. And we begin to see what's known as lineages, where we begin to see additional changes. And as you see, we begin to see like a specialization, a grouping of what we know as conglomerates or clusters in certain geographic areas. From these lineages, we'll see more changes. And as I said, as the virus is transmitted more and more and is replicated more and more, it has more opportunities of generating these changes and these mutations. Thus, the variants begin to appear. So as a result of these lineages, we see what we now know as the variants. And as you see, all of this is reflected in some way in the virus itself. And that's what we see. Those are the changes we see in the genetic material, in the genome, and they're reflected in the way in which the viruses change and generate what we begin to know then as variant. If you imagine this process, from the moment the virus was introduced and began to be transmitted, from Wuhan, the process has taken place thousands and thousands and thousands of times. And that's why what we have is something like this. Imagine then that we have an enormous amount of lineages, an enormous amount of variants, all circulating, distributed globally. And right now, there are more than 1,450,000 sequences of the viral genomes, which have been uploaded into the most important global database, which is the GSAID. And as you see, there are many, many variants. There are hundreds of these variants, and the process changes every day. The more the virus is given the opportunity to transmit itself, the more opportunities it has to change and more opportunities to create these lineages, genetic groups, or variants. And here, I'd like to stop for a minute and tell you of something that's very important. This name of genetic group or lineage or variant or what have you are denominations which are generally arbitrary. They do not respond to any taxonomic or official hierarchy. And that's why sometimes the name or the way in which we name them can be very different and can change from one environment to another. Basically, that's because it's not anything official. These are just changes or nomenclatures which occur based on the changes that we see here, precisely in this type of studies, but are really not a hierarchic level of the virus. The SARS-CoV-2, there's really only one. And from there, whatever happens is simply what we see here. And that's also the reason why we avoid the use when we refer to the clades or the genetic groups or the lineages or the variants, we avoid giving them names or country names because that can lead to a stigmatization of a country when related to a variant that could eventually be generating some problem. These mutations, it's also important to mention, some of these mutations or changes that occur can be deleterious for the virus. Some of these mutations can cause the virus to eliminate itself or die completely. Some mutations, in fact, most of these changes are neutral. In other words, they cause no change in the virus and the virus can remain basically the same. And some mutations, some of these changes can be advantageous for the virus. In other words, they can offer advantages to the virus itself. And what we refer to is that, and it's important to think, what makes the change in this virus? Why does the virus change? What are the possible consequences of this? Well, these changes, as I just mentioned, may lead to advantages for the virus to achieve its objective. Let's say it that way. What's the virus's objective? The objective of the virus is to infect a cell, improve the capacity to enter the cell, and once it's inside, then to replicate. And the virus is escaping from the immune possibility, the natural immune response or generated by a vaccine. That's what the virus is seeking, to replicate itself more and more and also escape from the immune response. A very simple way is that all viruses need to enter a cell in order to replicate, in order to live. A virus cannot live if it's not within a cell. That's why it needs to enter the cell. And it's the same reason why normally a virus doesn't want to kill its host, because in that process of change and evolution, normally viruses evolve and become maybe more transmissible, but not more aggressive or dangerous, because it's not convenient for them to kill the host. It's not, they don't want to hurt the host because that's where they need to live and to replicate. For this process, in order to enter, for the virus to be able to enter a virus and maintain its replicability, it needs an entry port, some way of entering into the cell. And that entry port is what you have heard mentioned frequently. And those are the receptors which are found on the cell. That's the entry port of the virus into the cell. And in this case, it is a protein which plays a biological role in the cell, which is called the angiotensin converting enzyme, which has a biological role in the cell. And the virus takes advantage of that in order to place one of its proteins, which you've heard mentioned frequently, which is the S protein or the spike, which is the one that is going to recognize the entry port. And that's where the virus is going to begin its entrance into the cell. And since this is the protein in charge of entering the cell, it is the protein that the virus is most interested in changing. That's the protein that the virus wants to improve precisely so that it can stick to that better and can enter it more. And that's why most of the mutation changes that have occurred and we've seen in the SARS-CoV virus have occurred in that protein, in that gene of that protein, because that's where it's trying to change so that it can adapt better and can really enter into the cell better. As we know, the immune system knows that this is the protein that the virus needs to enter the cell. The immune system, what it does is to generate a response to the antibodies, generating them so that they stick and avoid the protein from having any contact with the receptor. And what the immune response in the humans is going to do, be it naturally or induced by the vaccine, is to generate these antibodies. And what the antibodies do basically is to stick to the protein so that, as you see here, they prevent the protein from being available to stick to the entry port. And that way, the virus is unable to enter the cell and is unable to replicate. And basically, that's what the antibodies do, and that's what the immune response does. Now, the problem is where we could have some problems is that some of the mutations could cause a change in the structure of the protein itself, changing it in such a way where the antibodies no longer recognize it. And then, as Dr. Alighieri mentioned, we have to be paying very special attention to these situations where what we know as the escape variant occurs, where the variants through the mutations are able to change the structure and the immune response no longer recognizes it. And that's what is part of what the virus wants to do, to find ways to avoid that immune response. Right now, thinking precisely of those viruses and changes or mutations that have led precisely to observe some of the viruses that could have greater capacity for transmission or could have a greater capacity to escape from the immune response is where we have seen some that have been called variants of interest or variants of concern. Uh, I left this in English because it's probably easier to understand. A variant of interest basically is the one that has had some of these changes that genetically and molecularly we know could, according to the mathematical models, could generate a public health effect. Normally, these are viruses that have been found in conglomerates or clusters circulating in considerably in a country. But however, it's not the virus that is transmitted the most in the environment or in the geographic area. But we have seen that it begins to increase its transmission capacity, and therefore it's called a variant of interest, precisely so that we have our eyes placed on that type of virus. But maybe the one that we're most interested in, the one we've most worked with in recent months, is the ones we call variant of concern. The variants of concern are those where we already have evidence that determines that they can be more transmissible or can in some way generate a negative impact on the virus epidemiology. They have increased their virulence or their ability to cause damage or or have changed the clinical presentation of the disease, or have generated a problem where the public health and protection measures used are no longer effective. For example, a therapeutic agent no longer working, like the diagnosis no longer useful, or the vaccine no longer efficient against some of these viruses. Those are the aspects which, as Dr. Alighieri mentioned, are so important. And we're working precisely on the epidemiology pillar so that we are aware of any change in the epidemiology and in unexpected increase in the cases, or with the clinicians to see if there's any change in the clinical presentation or the severity of the disease. And we're working also with our colleagues from the Pillar 10 with vaccinations to see whether the vaccines at some point could lose their effectiveness. And that's why these variants are the ones that we call variants of concern. And at this time, in fact, on Monday of this week, or starting Monday of this week, we've added another variant of concern. Up until last week, we had 3. This week, we now have a 4th variant of concern, which I'm sure you've heard mentioned, which are here on the board. And we have the names of the official names of these variants according to the classification given by the databases. We have the B117, which was originally found in the United Kingdom, the B1351 reported initially in South Africa, B1128 or P1 also detected initially in Brazil, and the one recently detected, the B1617, detected predominantly in India.
These variants then have found some of these changes that, as we've seen, can be involved in the process and with some consequences that could be an enhanced transmission capacity or an escape from immune response. And so far, and we have to say this, the classification of these variants of concern is given essentially because these variants, it has been proven that they have a greater transmissibility and a higher capacity to be transmitted and to be spread than other variants. And therefore, these 4 currently, what we're studying and what we're seeing is a greater transmissibility, but we have not seen other effects, other side effects for the time being. Now, currently, we're about to conclude, but simply to show the variants that have been reported currently in the region of the Americas. We have 37 countries or territories that have confirmed at least one variant of concern. The B117 has been reported in these 34 countries or territories, B1351 in 17, B1128 or P1 in 20, and 17 in 8 countries, including the US and Canada, B1617. So this is a situation with the countries that have reported these variants of concern. And since the most recent one, and it is for which we have less information and we're just starting to study more in depth, we simply wanted to make a specific reference to the B1617 because this last Monday was classified as a variant of concern. So what we know in the region has been one case that one detected in the state of San Luis Potosí in Mexico. It is not very clear, unclear travel history. We're researching this. Another case that was detected in the city of Panama at the airport, a traveler returning from India. We have 2 cases in Argentina with 2 passengers returning from Europe. And we should also say that in these 3 countries, the other 3 variants of concern had already been previously detected. On the other hand, this B1617 in the Caribbean, one case was detected in Aruba in April, and the other 3 cases had already been detected previously with the other 3 variants, also in Aruba. In Guadeloupe, one case was detected. It was detected in March. And in St. Martin, in the Dutch territory of St. Martin, we have 2 travelers, one coming from the US, and we detected that this variant, B1617. I conclude then with final remarks. And this is where we'd like to discuss with you at length. To repeat, the mutations are naturally expected in the virus evolution and adaptation process. That these are expected, they're normal in many viruses, and in a way we expect them to happen. And other variables, although they've demonstrated enhanced capacity to replicate and transmit, which are those known as variants of concern, are not more aggressive or severe. We don't have any evidence in order to link them to greater severity or a change in the clinical form. The impact on reinfections are to escape the immune response. As we saw, it hasn't been clearly established. And so far, there is no evidence in order to infer that current available vaccines do not protect, do not work with these variants that are circulating in the world. So the studies done so far allow us to think that all vaccines that have been certified through mechanisms for emergency use by WHO are covering and are working for all the variants that are currently circulating. The diagnosis so far has not been affected, so we don't have any problems in order to diagnose these. The more the virus is transmitted, then the more the chance to generate mutations. That is why, in current circumstances, we can expect to have more variants. Undoubtedly, they will continue to emerge. I insist. This is a process because the more the virus is transmitted, the more the greater the probability to be transmitted. So we have to stop the transmission, irrespective of any variant, independently from whatever we have. We need to stop the transmission, which is what we have to focus on, and the only way of avoiding the generation of additional variants. And therefore, the final message is that we have to maintain all the public health measures, the use of a mask, social distancing. All these measures have to be maintained in order to avoid the spread of the virus, and hand in hand with the strengthening the surveillance of both epi as well as genetic. So with this, I conclude my introduction. And Sebastian, back to you.
Muchas gracias, Jairo.
Thank you very much, Jairo, for that presentation and for all the explanations and the details on the variants. We've already received several questions in the Q&A, and we're taking note of these questions to address them as soon as we're done with the presentations. Remember that you can send more questions through the Q&A, and we have simultaneous interpretation into English. I will say it in English just in case there are some people that perhaps have not realized that we have interpretation.
English, so you can click in the interpretation button here at the end, and you can choose interpretation. Gracias. Ahora sí.
Thank you. Now, I'd like to give the floor to Fernando Mota. He's a researcher from the Osvaldo Cruz Foundation, the Fiocruz Foundation in Brazil. That's one of the reference laboratories in the regional network for genomic surveillance coordinated by PAHO. And Fernando will be telling us a little bit about that network and the role of these reference laboratories in that network. Fernando, if you're with us. Yes, I apologize. I forgot to turn on my video. In fact, I have 4 or 5 slides that I can share with you just to tell you a little bit about the network. Give me just 1 minute. Please go ahead, no problem. This is something that I prepared quickly, but I believe that this could be helpful. Give me just 1 second.
¿Puede ver mi pantalla?
Can you see the screen?
Perfecto.
Yes, we can see the screen. Then there is a network. Obviously, we're talking about the entire region, but I work here in Brazil, and we have the influenza network, which is this one that I'm showing with different shades of blue. And this is divided into 3 parts. This is an internal network in Brazil, and it is an influenza network. And this network was used at the beginning in order to begin with the sequencing of coronavirus. So what we did in Brazil, and what happened in most countries in the Pan American region, was the use of the structures that already existed. So our laboratory is in Rio de Janeiro, in the Osvaldo Fiocruz Institute. It is the main institute for the influenza network, and that is why we started working as a header for coronavirus surveillance in coronavirus. We added a lot of names to the network. I'm talking specifically about Brazil, but we added to this network different institutes in other states that also were brought in, besides those that we already had present in the previous influenza network that triggered the whole process at the beginning of the pandemic. So we had one first moment where the surveillance network, influenza surveillance network, took on the sequencing of the new virus, the novel virus, and so it presented the first data. And later on, it was necessary that other groups would be involved, not only in 3 specific laboratories, as the influenza network was adjusted in order to account for the need for sequencing. So all these that you see in dark blue are institutes that nowadays are working with the sequencing in different areas in Brazil. And even in the genomic network of Fiocruz, which are those that you see in dark blue, which are represented here. So now in Brazil, we have a huge network. We have 2 major networks that are working together, producing data for the Ministry of Health. Obviously, in a much greater structure, the Pan American Health Organization had also adjusted a surveillance network for influenza, the same way many years ago. And as it happened in countries, the surveillance network, genomic surveillance network of the Pan American Health Organization that worked with a different virus, but specifically with influenza, also started to work, obviously, with coronavirus. So here we have, I don't know whether you can see the slide and whether it is kept up to date with the most recent information, but essentially the idea of this network, this regional network that was covered and taken in charge by the Pan American Health Organization was to have the largest number of countries involved with different capacities. Some of these countries receiving training in order to do in loco sequencing because they would need the capacity in order to do this. But some other countries that did not have this capacity at the time or did not have the possibility of developing this capacity in a short period of time because of the urgent need that we were facing. And because of this, the Pan American Health Organization was able to designate different institutes in some countries, as Jairo just mentioned, so that they would be capable or have the capacity of taking on samples, receiving samples from other members of the organization from other countries. And so in receiving the countries, they could perform the sequencing, they could produce the data, and to return to these countries the data produced so that they could then have the real idea of what we have in the region. So it was a beautiful strategy, very quick, a decision that was made by the organization, by PAHO, that turned this capacity, countries that did not have the research capacity, to find out what sort of virus, what virus is circulating in their countries at the time, and to be able to have that notion because of what was adjusted and by the information provided by several countries. Now we only have 2 regional laboratories for sequencing, but here I increased the number of laboratories and I added those, the main laboratories, the initial laboratories at Fiocruz in Brazil and the Public Health Institute in Chile, INDRE in Mexico, University of West Indies in Trinidad, and obviously CDC in the US. So several countries are segregating this around this network, using countries receiving training in order to produce in loco their sequences or sending samples so that this can be done in one of these regional labs. So essentially, the idea with these labs was to work on methodologies and sequencing protocols, sequencing methods that could be exchangeable. So, for example, our laboratory in Brazil standardized protocols that were capable of being used in different sequencing platforms, taking into account different technologies installed in the different institutes capable of doing sequencing in the network. So this is a protocol that can be used with different methodologies. from the methodology, the oldest methodology, which is a well-established methodology, which is the blood protocol, but with a less capacity, all the way down to the newest methodologies, which is what we call new generation methodologies that can give us a large amount of data in a short period of time, such as Lumina, Anatonity, and other methodologies. So with these types of protocols, these master protocols, patterns established by different groups, possible of being sent to different countries in order to work with the different methodologies, protocols capable of being used differently, easy to use. Different studies were conducted at the beginning, and so that led to the initial status of the sequencing of this virus. So here we have the results generated by our protocol in laboratories of our network. But in other laboratories of the PAHO network, they produced similar results. They published similar results with their protocols capable of being used with different laboratories in the network. So essentially what we did was at the beginning, the initial characterization of what we had circulating in Brazil and in neighboring countries to Brazil, later on with countries outside South America, even in countries in the Caribbean and throughout the entire region. So that was the idea. Essentially, what we have today, and this is a graph, a chart that we currently have in Brazil, and the different colors represent different lineages, viral lineages circulating as time goes by. Then you can see the change in the color, which obviously shows the changes in different lineages that are more or less prevalent. This means that they're found more frequently or less frequently, and you can clearly see how this changes over time because of everything that Jairo told us about the variability of these RNA virus. But what is important is that this is a graph, and graphs such as this one is being generated and will be generated for the entire region. All countries involved in the strategy of the Pan American Health Organization, precisely because today we've already established this network that is working in order to produce the data. So essentially, this is what I wanted to show you. These are very simple slides that I prepared in order to kick this off, to get it going and to begin the conversation. Not to completely finish with the whole matter. So essentially, what we have today is a network that, as I said previously, was established on the basis of an initial network that already existed, that was already working. It was expanded. It was obviously adapted in order to work with the new need that we were facing with these new novel viruses. So all of this organized, headed by PAHO, with the support of Jairo, with Dr. Sylvain Ligueri, and all the participants, and obviously with our support in the different laboratories involved, both the contribution of the capacity for those who cannot perform a sequencing currently. Thank you. Thank you very much, Fernando. You can also send us a question that you have on the network or on the sequencing of the virus over the Q&A. If you can give us your name and your media, and we will take your questions here with Fernando, Sylvain, and Jairo. But in order to begin with the questions, we've received a few questions from you. And Jairo, previously you mentioned this thing about the denomination of variants of concern. And when we speak of a concern for whom specifically? Because we've received questions from journalists saying, should the population in the country be worried because of this new variant that was detected or be concerned because of the new variant? Thank you very much, Sebastian. Thank you for the question. It is very important to take into account that the name, the designation of variant of concern is more for epidemiologists or for health systems and for scientists. Why? Because As we were explaining, and the first statement made by Dr. Alighieri, and as I was discussing during my presentation, what is important is that we have to see if any of these variants of concern change the clinical form of the disease. For example, we started seeing that it becomes more lethal, people die more, or if we see the children die more, or these things. That is what we have to see, and that could happen with a variant that is being spread quicker. We haven't seen any impact so far. The only thing, as I mentioned, currently the only concern, and that is why they're called variants of concern, is because we've seen that they do spread quicker. That is to say, now with what we call a viral load, a burden. In the past, if you could spread this to 2 people, now you can spread it to 4. So therefore, that is why it spreads quickly. But as usual, the message for the population in general is that irrespective of any variant, I have to keep my mask, I have to keep my distance. There is no special mask for the variant in Peru. There's no different distancing for the variant 351. All variants are transmitted the same way. They all use the same mechanisms. So the message is really that irrespective of the variant, we have to keep using those measures. And so far, the only concern, as I was showing, is because we've seen that it does have a faster rate of transmission, but so far no impact on the change in the disease. Thank you, Jairo. The next question is by Ana Lucia and Lola, Prensa Libre, Guatemala. And she says that so far they've detected the new strains of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. Some are more contagious. What can be expected for countries such as Guatemala, where the capacity of performing laboratory tests in order to determine what strains are circulating in the territory is limited? And also what measures ought to be taken by countries in order to avoid from having these new strains coming into their territory?
Eso es para mí.
This is for me? Please, Fernando. Yes. We can add to whatever the other one says. You can start answering the questions. Well, it seems to me that all these variants of concern, as Jairo described, are a very specific denomination, very academic, because we spend our time just giving names to things in order to separate groups, to be able to separate and how the virus changed. This virus is more recent, this is older, and so. So this is one thing. When we have, and what is important is that irrespective of what the lineage of concern is, of concern or not, so far, all of these are very well covered by the diagnosis and the methodologies that we're currently using. So countries that have the possibility of performing a diagnosis, this diagnosis is reliable because there's no way of losing these variants of concern, for example. There's no specific way in order to block a virus such as this one of respiratory transmission in an effective way. Obviously, you can protect if you have to, or if you need to be protected, you need to use all non-pharmacological methods, as Jairo said, masks, social isolation or social distancing. But I don't know, and I believe that Jairo can describe this better than I do, or Dr. Alighieri too. They can say this better. So all these attempts to block the virus, the entry of the virus into different countries by closing borders, all of that is very weak because a virus of respiratory transmission can be transmitted easily. Just one person that crosses the border. And many times these people are asymptomatic. So the methodologies are to look for those that you have, to perform the test of these people that have symptoms, obviously, look for the people who show symptoms and keep them in isolation. We have to take into account the fact that many times it is not possible to know whether this is a variant of concern or not, because if you want to have this response, in order to do it, you need to do sequencing, and this is a methodology that is not currently available. So much more important than knowing if there's a new virus or a new variant that is being circulating in the country, this is very important, obviously. It's important to know what is circulating in the country. But what is even more important to be considered is that if you have a positive sample, how to do the blocking of that positive sample in your country. And the simplest way that we have is what we said here: follow the methodology, social distancing, blocking those the contacts, ideally reporting these people for epidemiological management and control of all these samples. That's all. Back to you. Thank you. I don't know whether Jairo or Dr. Alighieri wish to say something. Well, I only have an additional comment, and then I'll give you the floor, Sylvan, to deal with the borders and the crossing of borders. In my specific case, in Guatemala, in fact, I will tell you what has been seen significantly in the ability to do sequencing. You already have a possibility of doing it. And as Fernando said in his presentation, through the network, we've had trainings between Fiocruz and Guatemala in order to help you out with the process. Guatemala has sent samples to these reference labs. And as Fernando said in his presentation, the network is open and Guatemala has taken active part in that process. So we are providing support so that they can grow in the process and be strengthened as to whether it is necessary to close or to prevent the virus from coming into the country. Maybe Sylvain can tell us a little more about that in terms of borders. Back to you. More than borders, I would like to stress public health measures. Several colleagues today during this session have stressed that the measures known, those that we have been using, work. Most of all, we need to implement the public health measures in a strict way. We have to monitor these closely, monitor the trends closely, and to do or perform monitoring on the implementation of those public health measures. Dr. Mota stressed very clearly that borders will not stop the virus. It is the measures. The measures will stop the spread of the virus, and better said, the enhancement or growth or amplification of the virus. And I'd like to leave it at that. Thank you to the three of you. The next question is from Jimenita Swine from Bahamas in English. She asks about vaccines and variants.
Work on COVID variants, and are variants transmitted in fully vaccinated persons? ¿Qué sabemos sobre esto que nos puedan?
What do we know about this that you can tell us, Jairo?
Voy a contestar en español, ¿está bien?
I will answer in Spanish. Is that okay? Yes, please go ahead. We have interpretation. So far, and maybe I will take advantage in order to address other questions that are very similar. And it seems to me that it's important to mention this. What we know so far at a global level is that vaccines, the way we have them now, and as I was saying, those that have been certified by the emergency mechanism of WHO for emergency use, work for all variants that are circulating. And here I have to say something, and I hope it's not highly technical, but some of the vaccines with some of those variants, the efficacy might drop a little. What do I mean by that? Well, they do work, yes, they work, but perhaps instead of working at a 95% level of efficacy, it might work at a 90%, but the person is protected. So irrespective of the variant, what we know so far is that the vaccines that are being applied work against all these variants. What don't we know so far? And this is something that Dr. Alighieri was saying at the beginning. We still have a lot of concerns and uncertainties. And it's because we're learning now with the vaccination, and we're just starting to increase the level of vaccination, particularly here in our region. We have to see what happens if a people, once are vaccinated, fully vaccinated, with a complete system, what is going to be the role of these people? If in fact it can be that they will be infected, but they won't have any symptoms, or if simply they're not capable of carrying the virus and transmitting the virus, spreading the virus, irrespective of whether it is a variant or not. That sort of thing is still being studied. That is why we have to be very careful. And as we've been repeating several times, and it was just stated by Dr. Alighieri. Therefore, our measures in our countries where the circulation is so high and where we still don't have a high number of the population vaccinated, we have to maintain these measures because we still have a long way to learn and to know what happens once we're all vaccinated and for how long we will truly be protected. So we have to be careful, but so far, all are covered with the vaccines the way we currently have them. Thank you. Thank you, Jairo.
Voy a despedir al doctor
I
Alighieri.
think I'm going to say goodbye to Dr. Alighieri, who had to leave because he has to be at another meeting. We want to thank him for being with us, but we continue. We have many questions in the chat with you, so we'll continue. I have several questions from Anthony Boado from Reuters. He says the first, if the variant N9 identified in Brazil is dangerous, another, well, let's do that one because there are three, but there are different variants, so maybe that might be a little complex. So let's go with one. N9 identified in Brazil, is it dangerous? The variant N9 is a change from the lineage of B.1.1.28, and it emerged within, it's a variation within that lineage. That lineage is one of the main ones that were circulating in Brazil last year up until the end of last year. November, December last year, we began to see some variants from the dominant lineages at the time. The P1 was one of these that emerged from the B1.1.28. What happens is that the P1 and the N9 are variants that are very similar to the P1, but with certain alterations or mutations in some of the areas, not only different changes from the P1s that we could say are the original P1s, but some additional changes. Even what's interesting or draws our attention are some deletions. In other words, when you remove part of the structure of the spike. But up to now, it's more of a lineage. It has not been identified as more dangerous. It's a lineage, and it's quite limited to some of the main states in the northeast of Brazil, but it's really not more dangerous. Thank you, Fernando. Another question is about the P1 variant. The question is the one identified in Manaus. Is there any evidence that the P1 variant is more lethal than the original virus? Well, that is the $64,000 question. As I said, up to now, all the epidemiologic when analyzed statistically don't show that the variant of concern produces worse cases in the P1s. But for sure, these viruses were transmitted very fast in the north of Brazil. Logically, what we saw there was a large number of cases in a very short period of time with a very high mortality rate. But it was clear that the epidemiologic situation or the clinical situation, and particularly the structure of the north of Brazil, the Manaus, was not capable of taking into consideration the large number of persons infected at the same time, which was generated a collapse of the structure. The situation we had there in the north of Brazil was pretty peculiar. It was association of the virus with high transmissibility, which though not having greater virulence, in other words, not producing a more severe reaction, the burden, the overload that occurred in the public health system was what led to the terrible data that we saw in the north of Brazil. So it's not something that could be blamed on the virus alone. It was a multifactorial situation which occurred, and that's why we had such a serious situation due to the P1. And in fact, the P1 today is the virus that is dominating in Brazil throughout the country. We don't have, and yet we don't have the same situation that we have in the north at the end of the year. Thank you, Fernando. There's a question I wanted to ask both of you, maybe Jairo. In the case of the Indian variant, several media were saying that it was more lethal. Does that have to do with maybe a mistaken interpretation of the fact that there's greater transmission and there are more people dying because more people were infected and there was no capacity to respond in the health system? That's why there are more deaths. How can you explain that? Because we are seeing more deaths and yet the variant is not more lethal, and sometimes it's difficult to understand that. Yes, that's a very good question, and it comes hand in hand with what Fernando was explaining. There are several scenarios. The virus, what it does is that it's more transmissible. So if I don't have strict distancing measures and public health control measures, then more people are going to be infected. And if more people are infected, obviously, I'm going to have the health systems saturated, as Fernando was explaining. If I saturate the health systems, it's going to be harder to offer the same care to all patients, and many more could become complicated and, of course, die. So it is sort of a relationship of several aspects. And Fernando also mentioned that one of the effects that often occurs, as we saw in Brazil, was that the P1 variant in Brazil displaced the others, and that's the one that's circulating right now. So evidently, if some people die, the variant I'm going to detect is precisely the P1 because that's the one that's circulating in the country at the time. So that's why it's the most common, and that's the one that's involved. That's multifactorial. Each one contributes something. When we say that there's no evidence, and maybe some of the questions are related to this, when we say that there's no evidence, it's precisely because molecularly, with the in vitro or in vivo assays made with some of the animal models, we have not seen that any of these viruses actually generate a greater damage. So in those models and mathematical models, we've seen that it doesn't really generate any greater damage. More transmission does, but that greater transmission is what makes us see as though an increased lethality, mortality, but it's really an epidemiologic effect. And as Fernando quite rightly said, it's the way in which we see it and the way in which the epidemiology sees it. Thank you, Jairo. A question from Angel Paez from El Universo from Ecuador, who asks, what mutations should the virus SARS-CoV-2 have to define itself as a strain? That's an interesting question. Actually, the definition of strain, and maybe there's another similar question. The definition of strain is normally given to a virus characterized as reference for a pathogen. In this case, for example, what we know as a strain is really the original virus from Wuhan, which is the reference strain. It's the original strain of the virus. It's not so much a given number of changes. When we definitely come to a limit in the complete genome of the virus, one could eventually even think of a strain or a different virus. But right now, most of the changes we are observing are only in a fragment of the genetic material of the virus. And that's why at this time, there's really no information nor sufficient changes to say that it could generate a new strain or even a new virus, because all the changes are really occurring more or less in the same area, and it would have to cause very big changes in the whole genome, which would be something like 30,000 bases. There would have to be many changes in the whole genome so that it could become a new virus or a new strain. As I was saying, we have to be very careful because we use all these denominations almost indistinctly: lineage, variant, strain, and in some cases, one could also say genotypes. And I insist, all those names are relatively pretty arbitrary and could cause confusion. And that's why we try to stick to what is most used right now, which are variants, to refer, because that gives us greater attention at this time. Thank you, Jairo. The next question is from Delisa Godinho from W Magazine, and she asks in English,
How many variants are there around the globe? Y también, is there a more specific vaccine under development to the new variants?
Yo voy a contestar una parte.
I'm going to answer part of that, and I'm going to answer part of the last question, and maybe Fernando can help me with the rest. Variants, there are many. I just wanted to mention that of all the panorama of variants, the ones that we're currently focusing on are the 4 variants of concern that we had in the presentation, and 6 that have been called variants of interest, as we saw, because they have the potential. We're watching them because potentially, because of the changes, they could become variants of concern. But we're following them, we're observing, we're collecting more evidence. As for the vaccines, as I said, we currently haven't seen the need to really change any of the vaccines. But, and here I'm saying this without any official information, maybe some of the vaccine producers are already adapting some of their vaccines to cover a larger number of variants or the variants of concern, so that they can increase the or actually reduce the probability of any escape. But I'll give the floor to Fernando so that he can tell us a little bit more about this. Yes, if we see in one single country, one could possibly find maybe 50 lineages already described. There are many more than that throughout the world. Many more will continue to be described. The majority, I would say most of them, will be described to our academic classification satisfaction, to understand the viral evolution, where it came up, and in a way to be able to track it and follow it, to see how the virus emerged in one place and another, and where it came from, where it went, where it was exported, and so forth. Only, as Jairo said, there's only really 4 at this time that are really variants of concern, which we have to be more careful with and take more into consideration. So the variants are going to have many variants, and it's not strange for people to find variants. And if there's a group that has the variant, or a few samples might come out and say, oh, we have a new virus, we have a new variant here. But what we have to take into consideration at all time is the next question. Yes, okay, you have a variant, but as Jairo showed, it is to be expected. What does this variant have that's important enough for us to pay attention to it? That's what we have to take into consideration, because to find variants, we're going to find variants all the time. When the virus is circulating as much as it is circulating right now throughout the world. Thank you. I have 2 questions. I'm going to read some from Roxana Tobocman and Kelly Romero from Nicaragua. Roxana asks, is there any measure or recommendation that could give us an idea of the genomic surveillance necessary for a country? Do you measure a certain number of samples, a percentage of the total, what percentage of travelers, what have you? And the next question, sort of related, is are currently all countries in the region, do currently all countries of the region have the genomic surveillance? In the laboratory maps, it doesn't seem to appear one from Nicaragua. Thank you for the questions. I'm going to make a couple of comments and maybe Fernando can complement after. As for the map of variants and capacities, as we mentioned, yes, in fact, some countries do have the capacity or have had it for other types of pathogens, and we're currently working with them to adapt this so that we can continue surveying COVID-19. But in the meantime, what's important here, as Fernando mentioned, is that all have access to the reference laboratories. In other words, everyone can find what their variants are and what are the variants they need to describe, and you're all going to be able to detect them and prove them. But I want to echo what Fernando was saying. Sometimes I think that we're focusing too much on the need to respond and to say what variants we have. And we have to think always that that's not, nor should it be the center of our attention. The important thing is for us to know that it doesn't matter what variants there are, I have to protect myself. And that's regardless of any variant circulating, as he explained quite rightly. The idea of reporting on these variants is more because from the point of view of the interest of an investigator so that we can investigate them. And it is important from an epidemiologic point of view to do the follow-up and to see whether it's a new introduction or how the virus is moving. That has more of an epidemiologic impact. As I was saying also, if the number of cases begin to increase in children, only in children, then they may be associated to a variant, and then we start investigating. That's why we need to know. But for us in our day-to-day activity, to know what variant is circulating really should not change our life because the measures will continue to be the same. For us, in fact, there's no change in the protection measures, regardless of the variants. The control and public health measures continue to be the same. I was seeing here a question about whether the quarantine should be longer or shorter depending on the type of variant. No, the quarantine remains the same. All of these principles remain exactly the same because there is really no change regardless of the variant. I don't know if Fernando wants to add anything to what I've said. Just to refer briefly to our experience here in Brazil, because that relationship of the representation or representativity of the amount of things that we have to have of what is circulating in the country. This is going to change enormously depending on the amount of population in the country and the way in which the people are displaced throughout the country. So in Brazil, for example, at the beginning, we did the sequencing of what we could sequence, which were the first groups that were in the possibility of doing it, did the largest number possible. Our group was the first, and then others in the surveillance network did it, and then others followed. But what was important was that we began somewhere. And then, logically, it's not possible to do the sequencing of all samples we receive. So we have to have the representation element. And for this, the best thing is for the research institutes in the countries to work together with the experts in statistics, because they're going to see the numbers that are necessary for us to have the representative element and say that with a smaller number of sequences, we can approximately know what we expect to be representative of the truth, if it were possible to sequence all samples present in the community. In Brazil, we are working or the network is working with collecting samples based on a specific number a week, which later are totalized monthly with the representation of the different regions so that we can compare the regions. And the time between them, and that way have a better idea of the representation of the different lineages in the country. And something else that I wanted to ask regarding that, because now we're speaking of the genomic surveillance of the virus, but what happens with the other surveillance done, the epidemiologic, the cases? Does that go hand in hand so that they can decide on what the governments should do? Yes, absolutely. In fact, I think that that's the most important aspect. We are working on something which Fernando mentioned, which is the concept of the molecular epidemiology. In other words, the data we have of the sequences can be joined with the epidemiologic surveillance to do follow-up of contacts, for example, regardless of whether it's a variant of concern or not. It allows us to see based on a contact how many people having the same virus or variant were infected. And that would then allow me to follow the chains of transmission eventually and see how the epidemiology is working, how many numbers of cases have increased with one variant in a given geographic area, and how many are infecting more children than adults or youths. All that can be joined together regardless of whether it's a variant of concern or not, and the importance of the impact of the genomic surveillance beyond the simple detection of variants just for curiosity reasons. It's so that we can put it together with a routine surveillance, as you said, so that we can do what we know as the molecular epidemiology, which is to be able to make sense of this and analyze it in context. That's the work that countries like Brazil have, in fact, been doing almost routinely. And we're just beginning to include this, which is not normally done here. It's done for other viruses. We're beginning to work here with the countries as well so that they can make more sense of what's found at a genomic level and not just limit ourselves to do sequencing just to detect variants, because as Fernando rightly said, we're going to find many variants. But what's the meaning of that? One could say, in fact, exactly what you said. One could say that for the public health authorities to know that these cases that came in, we can follow it because of the genomic surveillance. And as a result of that, I know that this was transmitted to so many people. And the need to do an isolation of the area or the isolation proposed for that area didn't work, for example. Those are the things that one takes into consideration based on this information. If we combine the epidemiologic data with the genomic data, as Jairo said, doing the molecular epidemiology surveillance. Thank you. Another question, which is closely related to what we're saying, is from Victor Alen from Berlin, who says, is there any relationship between the generation of aggressive variants like the British or South African, Brazilian, or Indian with the flexibilization, the relaxing of the measures like the social distancing and so forth? I'm going to repeat. In fact, I saw that there was another comment regarding an article in Nature which says that the 117 variant, which was the most aggressive, well, I insist, there's no evidence showing. There have been studies that, in fact, are contrary and where the results of one are different from the other. So that's why we really don't know whether they're more aggressive or not. And there are very few cases, in fact, and that's why we insist that to date, there really is no variant that's more aggressive. Now, what we have seen from a biological point of view and everything we've said today, if we relax the control measures, if we begin to remove the mask and stop the vaccine, then maybe I don't need so much social distancing. I can begin to have more meetings and I can remove the mask and have more social contact. If we have large events, massive events with a lot of people, that of course is, as we said, going to allow the virus a greater possibility of transmitting. And the more it's transmitted, the more opportunities it has to generate variants. That's why definitely any process where we relax the measures, where the virus is still circulating actively, intensively, will probably generate variants. There is that possibility. That's why we insist, beyond the simple fact that we have these variants, what we have to do is to maintain strict measures until we really reach what is known the herd immunity, the level, the very high vaccination levels in our countries, and especially until we know that once we've vaccinated, we're definitely not going to be able to transmit, or we're definitely not going to be reinfected. All of these things that are still under study. So we have to be very prudent and definitely maintain all the measures. Thank you, Jairo. I have a question from Pabla Galinsky from the Itralia Garín in Argentina. Do we know about the reinfection associated to variants?
Nosotros,
We actually, the first reinfections detected in Brazil were associated to variants, or I should say different lineages. One of these was precisely work done by the team in the north of Brazil in Amazon, where there was a reinfection for the P1 lineage at the time, and I'm talking about December of last year. What happens is that a person had the first infection and then a second infection in the Amazon region as a result of a variant. But that was expected because at the time, all the viruses, or practically the whole virus that was circulating in the Amazon, was of the P1 variant. So the person who had the first contact, which for some reason did not have an adequate response or didn't maintain a sufficient immunological response for protection, had a reinfection at the time due to a P1 lineage of the variants of concern. But the first reinfections we detected in Brazil were with the initial infection with the B1.1.33, and then with the P2, which were different lineages. And neither of the two are variants of concern, neither of them. What we saw was that there was distancing between 8 months, 6 to 8 months between the contacts. And what can be said is that these people did not have a good response because they were associated to the individual and not to the type of virus. So this is something that must be clearly understood. In a situation where we have millions of persons contracting the virus, it's common to see a possible reinfection when we're talking about respiratory viruses. I mean, we have taken vaccines for influenza, and we take the influenza vaccine every year and we change it precisely because every year we may have a reinfection due to the influenza virus. It's a common thing of viruses, especially the respiratory viruses, because we don't have the sicknesses of children like measles, for example, where it's very common to, it's very, very common, for example, to have only one episode in one's life because they have the immunity that will protect them for life. But in the case of these respiratory viruses, it's not the case. The respiratory disease is probably the most common disease of women throughout, people throughout their life, sorry. And it's one of the diseases that we see most frequently. So what happens is that with the large number of circulating virus and the very large amount of detections done in the laboratories, it's possible to find these reinfections, which are not produced by the other viruses as much. But the fact is that we did not have any other respiratory virus, maybe virus in general, but in the history of mankind that have been tested as much as the coronavirus. So the more you test the influenza or any respiratory viruses, the more we'll be checking the reinfection phenomenon. But what could happen with a normal lineage, or it could happen with a lineage of concern or with the normal lineage, and it's more associated to the lineage which is circulating at the time, which is mainly associated to the individual who had the disease and who for some reason did not actually develop the immunity to protect him. Yes, thank you. We still have several questions in the Q&A. The next question I'm going to read in English is from
The Good Magazine en Trinidad y Tobago. Dice, will the discovery of variants in countries in the Caribbean and Latin America affect the cycle threshold for COVID testing? What is the current cycle threshold being used at the moment for countries in Latin America and the Caribbean? If it's different, what effect will this have on the data overall?
Si se refiere el threshold, si se refiere a la parte
If by threshold you refer to the technical point, the cutoff point when you perform the diagnosis, in fact, in theory, it wouldn't have to change. We've seen that some virus, and maybe just like variant P1, have higher viral loads. So it means that I may have that cutoff point that I would have it at a lower level, and that could happen. But it is not something that we expect will be seen or that would entail a major change in the region. So, and also, as we said previously, so far, the diagnostic methodologies that we've used in the region have not been affected in no way. They all still recognize, those that we've implemented in the region, recognize the virus irrespective of any variant. And that was also discussed by Fernando. So they're not escaping because of the diagnosis. We're not missing them because of the diagnosis. So we're not hoping, we're not expecting, or we don't see a significant change that we see cutoff or threshold that are lower or different. It is not something that we see currently as a critical situation. Thank you, Jairo. Next question from Laura Sanchez from Correo de Caroní, south of Venezuela on the border with Brazil. And the question is whether Venezuela is part of the countries that are being supported for sequencing of the virus and its variants. Well, in fact, I'm repeating this. All countries in the region have access to the network, and they have access to PAHO's support in different ways. As Fernando was saying, in fact, Venezuela already has laboratories with the capacity to perform sequencing with different methodologies, and we are supporting both the laboratories with critical material so that they can maintain that surveillance, but also with open doors, complete open doors and full support so that the samples will be sent to any one of the reference laboratories that were already mentioned by Fernando. We have 6 in the region. In any one of these labs, through the PAHO network, you can send the samples and the specimens. So the answer is yes, just like any other country in the region, we're completely open. Thank you, Jairo. Several questions. I will read a few from Zoraida Portillo for Science Dev, and they say something that I believe we're already covered. If anyone had COVID and they get infected again with another variant, will the immunization reached with the first infection will be sufficient in order to avoid the mortal effects, or they can die during the second infection? And the second question that I'd like to ask you from Zoraida says, if it could happen that a specific variant, for example, that identified in Brazil, could be combined with another one, such as the one identified in India, and what could be the possible result? Somewhat speculative. Well, I will begin answering, and then Jairo can add to this. The first part of the question, I forgot, because I was interested in the second part, but the first part of the question was, if you've already been infected, could you be reinfected? Well, obviously, this is something, as I said at the beginning, that is highly individual. It depends on the individual, the person with the infection. It means that your immunological system did not create a lasting response capable of preventing a second infection. This could happen because of various reasons: immunosuppression, or the way in which the infection happened. And so, what we have from reports so far from infections is that it is possible to have more severe cases, but it is also possible to have more lenient cases or not so severe cases. In connection with the second part of the question, the virus cannot recombine. There's no possible because of the biological characteristics of these viruses. We do not have or we do not expect to have a mixture, a blend, a combination of different lineages that circulate in the country because of the mixture of two different lineages and then have a third one. No, the way in which the lineages arise is because of the infection or reinfection of the people, the natural change that happens because of the mechanisms that Jairo explained at the beginning of his talk. So this rearrangement or mixture, combination of the different virus, we do not expect them to produce new virus. The production of new virus happens because of reinfection, because of the constant infection of the persons and the constant replication of virus in the community. It's because of this that the random emergence of a new variant. Thank you. We still have several questions and a little more time to continue with this session. Talking a little bit about the variants, we've seen some reports that spoke of dual mutant variants. Jairo, is that correct? Should they be identified as such? Thank you. No. In fact, it is not really an accepted term, and this double mutant or dual mutant does not exist. It was a name that was very colloquially given to this, precisely to the B.1.6.17 variant. It was the Indian variant, because we found that at the same point, you could have one mutation or a change that could be different on the same variant. This means that in the same position, I could have a change, and that another virus with the same variant in that same position, I could have a different change. But in fact, as we already said this today, these changes happen randomly. And in fact, that variant, this B.1.6.17 has been defined as a sub-variant or sub-lineages, which are those that have those additional changes, but it continues to be the same. It is the B.1.6.17 that it is the one that prevails in India currently. But as I was saying, this term that it is a double mutant or dual mutant does not exist. There was more than one mutation in one same place, but in fact, it's a name that we have. Thank you. Fernando, Amanda Munoz, a journalist from Uruguay, is asking about the scientific production linked to these variants of SARS-CoV-2. We are under the impression that we have much more scientific information about the variants that have greatly affected European countries, much more so than about the P1. And she's asking whether this is the case, whether you think that there's any disparity between scientific production and how dangerous the variants are. She says that she also understands that what is known about P1 are data obtained from a research in Manaus with a whole collapsed health system. And she's asking whether you can transfer these observations to other regions or whether we need more research. Thank you for the question. I think that at the beginning, obviously, the way we began with the description of the variant, that this was in Manaus. And so the first publications, because the question is specifically about scientific publications. So the first publications were from data obtained from Manaus. But now you can look in the different repositories and even on the website of the Genomic Network of Fiocruz, you can look for different publications with the different variants, not only P1 in different states in Brazil, and how it was found. And you can find the history of the variation, even the variation with the P1s, because when we speak of N9 and 10, these are all the results of publications and studies performed outside the region of Manaus with a P1 variant that emerged there. And 9 and 10 are variants linked to P1 because they do have similar things. But these are with the data done outside Manaus. So we already have a lot of information. Specifically, when I refer to Brazil, there's some information from outside Manaus available and some work that has been published. Obviously, there are more things because there are more groups working in the northern part of the world, more research institutes working up north. They began working before we did with the data that they had from China, Europe, and all the rest. And there's the standardization of the knowledge, which is even stronger in research institutes in the north, with some more investment, with more scientists working on this. So obviously, this is something that turns at the number of publications produced by the region, specifically the way we're discussing things now, South America, the Caribbean, Central America, to be smaller in comparison with data generated in other regions that have a strong load of scientific research as in the US, but we have a lot of information and relevant information on the network and in the network. Thank you, perfect. We have several questions. The next one from Pamela Ramcharan. Pamela from Trinidad and Tobago. And in English, the question is,
the number of COVID-19 cases has been increasing over the last few weeks, which recently led to a partial lockdown. We also see an increase in deaths of persons in their 30s with no comorbidities. Dr. Mendez Rico said there is no evidence to indicate that the virus variants are more aggressive or severe. What do you believe contributed to those deaths, and has anything similar been identified elsewhere?
Gracias por esa pregunta.
Thank you for that question. And it goes hand in hand with something that is happening and going on in several countries, not only in Trinidad. We see a similar process. And we have to see this from the point of view of epidemiology. As we've known, and since last year, a lot of work has been done, hard work, in order to protect people with underlying conditions, comorbidities, or the older population who've been more severely infected by this co-infection. We've seen a phenomenon, older population, the oldest people, in a much more responsible way, fearing the infection, are those that have better respected these control and protection measures. They've kept isolated by themselves, that they've been stricter with these protection measures and public health measures, precisely because they know that the infection could be a bit more aggressive in that population. So therefore, the virus is still circulating, but with the older population protecting themselves more, and it leads the virus to go to where the people, in a way, are more relaxed. So younger population, young people who feel perhaps that if they're infected, it won't be that serious, they won't have any problems. Usually they're more relaxed. And that has been seen in many places where the younger population go out more, they meet, they get together more. They stick less to measures such as wearing a mask. They go to different places, they mingle, they socialize. And so therefore, this becomes a population where the virus circulates more. And as we had already said, the transmission is increased. And therefore, the probability of having severe cases in this population also increases. So I insist that this is a perception that from the epidemiological point of view has an explanation. And it is precisely that. I insist. we cannot, in quotes, blame only the fact that we have one variant more or less transmissible, but for all these impacts on the possible relaxing of the measures, and that I insist in any population, we all have to keep them up.
Gracias, Jairo.
Thank you, Jairo.
Dos preguntas similares.
Two similar questions, Manuel Palominos and Carol Donaire. Manuel says,
Radio ADN
Radio ADN
en Chile.
in Chile, and he says he'd like to know what information you have on a possible Chilean variant, he says in quotes, and also regarding the Andean variant that could be in Peru and Chile. And also, they're asking whether they have a Peruvian variant. Thank you for the question. In fact, I'd like to begin by saying that there's no Andean variant. In fact, this was heard in some media and social media and networks regarding a variant that could be circulating, that could be a variant that is prevailing in Peru and Chile. It has also been detected in Ecuador, and that is the C37 variant. It is a name that we've given this provisionally to in data banks, and that variant comes. And it is a process of some additional changes. It is a variant that had already been circulating towards the end of December, and perhaps it was circulating in Peru, which is B111. And as of that, that triggered some changes that now in the databases, it appears as a different variant, another lineage, which is C37. However, although we have found an increase in the number of cases with this variant in Peru and in Chile as well, we've found this significantly, it is not linked to any specific change. It is not linked to any unusual increase in the infection. Studies are being performed in order to determine whether it could have something that will make it more significant. Currently, they have not been classified. It is not a variant of interest or variant of concern. And as I was saying, it does get this name. It is not good to speak of the Peruvian, Chilean, or Andean variant beyond what we said today, not to stigmatize countries, but in fact, the variant has also been detected in other countries, even in Europe. So it is not very clear what the origin of it is. It might very well be that the origin could be one of our countries, but in fact, that is not clear. We don't have a lot of information, and therefore we prefer to follow the official names. In this case, it is the C.37 variant.
Gracias, Jairo.
Thank you, Jairo.
Teresa Moreno
Teresa Moreno in Mexico is asking how many variants have been identified in Mexico, and also how fast is the virus mutating. And linked to vaccines, and we've already answered this, what is the impact of the great variation in the virus in the vaccines if they continue to be efficacious? In Mexico, I must say there's a network, an impressive network such as the one that you have in Brazil. Mexico also heads this with the Diagnostic Epidemiological Reference Institute, INDRE. They have a very robust network with all the states are participating and doing hard sequencing job. And therefore, they've detected and shown the circulation of a large number of variants. Currently, we have different variants circulating in Mexico, and I would say that at least 10 different variants that have been detected. It might very well that there might be more. Of these variants, as we saw here, in Mexico, we've also detected the variants of concern. And when I say that they have been detected, it doesn't mean that they're circulating widely or have generated a specific impact. It means that they've been detected, some cases with the travelers, and in other cases, very sporadic cases. But let's say that is why we're following these up. And amongst these variables, there's one that in Mexico in particular, and taking advantage of the question, that has been growing a bit, at least in Mexico City. It started moving away other variants that are circulating in the country, which is the 519. And this variant, in Mexico at least, can be classified as a variant of interest because in Mexico, it has followed this process of displacing others, and it is the one that is the predominant variant. It doesn't have any trait, unique trait that would allow us to think that it is more aggressive. In Mexico, I insist, we've seen that it has this potential to replace other variants. But in other countries where this variant has been seen, it has not triggered any impact. So that's why, for the time being, only in Mexico, locally, it is classified as a variant of interest for Mexico, but at a global level, it does not have this designation. Thank you, Jairo. The last questions. We have a few minutes for today's session, and thank you, everyone. They're still connected, sending questions. We have another question in social media that we get from Jose David Arango from Stanford Arango. He said that whether we can speak of a corona dengue. I don't know whether you have any information about corona dengue. No, so far, my lab is a neighboring lab to the one that works with dengue and other viruses that are transmitted by arbovirus. But so far, we don't have any information about both things are happening at the same time. The two infections in the same patient or the two illnesses in the same patient, but it is a possibility as soon as we have the most favorable seasons, the transmission of dengue in our country at the beginning of the year, for example, but so far we don't have any information about that. With your permission, I'd like to offer a comment. This thing about corona dengue, I saw that somewhere, and it is a name that scares me a bit. It's of concern because it doesn't have any grip and it doesn't make any sense. As Fernando just said, in fact, the possibility of a person being infected at the same time with both viruses exists, among other things, because these are two viruses that have a very different transmission mechanism. And as Fernando said, if I'm in an area where both are circulating, I can have coronavirus. And if I get stung by a mosquito with dengue, then I can get dengue. And that could happen with a mechanism where a person can have both. We can detect both in a person, not because there's a cross reaction between both viruses or anything like that, but it is simply because they can have both, be infected by both. If it is more aggressive or can lead to more death, we don't know. The most probable thing is that one of the two will be in a way predominant. And in that case, it could be that if dengue infects first and it takes advantage, the person will be worse off, and you have to follow closely the symptoms for dengue, or they might have respiratory symptoms, and then we have to worry about COVID. It is very important to take into account that the signs and symptoms of dengue and COVID are very different. And although we can have a fever at the beginning, in dengue, we must always have a clear understanding of the signs that lead us to believe that a patient has dengue, that will be worsened or take the necessary measures. So we don't have to think as to whether it is corona or dengue. If a well-trained clinician thinks that this is dengue, it has to be treated as dengue. If a well-trained clinician believes that this is an infection because of COVID, because of the respiratory manifestations, they have to be treated because of COVID. So there shouldn't be any confusion. Thank you. Even because we also have a way of making a diagnosis in the lab. Exactly. Thank you for the clarification. We have another question from Lidia Lopez from La Prensa, Nicaragua. PAHO announced that they would donate to Nicaragua materials for molecular screening and detect the variants. How long will it take for the diagnostic center to be able to identify these? And if we identify the variant, what is the next step? That's a very good question. And it gives a way to discuss a strategy that we're implementing in the region in a way to facilitate things. As Fernando said a few minutes ago, it's very difficult. It will be impossible to sequence all samples or specimens available. That is why we're trying to look for mechanisms that will enable us to limit and to do some screening of what are the specimens that have to be sequenced. And also because of Fiocruz in the Amazon, they developed a methodology that enables me to detect in a generic way. And I have to speak about the 3 variants of concern that were circulating until last week. Then what is the mechanism about? A specimen that is positive with surveillance, I perform the PCR, and if positive, the most probable, it's not confirmed, but the most probable thing is that it is one of these variants of concern. Therefore, I know that we need to sequence this one to know what sort of variant it is. So it is not that it's replacing sequencing, but it allows me to limit those specimens that will be sequenced, and that is why it's called screening. In fact, we're delivering the material in several countries, including Nicaragua. This is a process that once we deliver the material, once it is received, it is very easy to use because it is based on the same PCR tool that we use for diagnosis. So it is a protocol that is very easy to use and to implement. And as I was saying, we've already delivered 25 countries that already have this protocol. And I insist in order to perform the screening and be a bit more efficient when we come to selecting these samples or these specimens that will be sequenced. Perfect, thank you. Another question from Jacqueline Charles, the Miami Herald in English, and it reads,
cases where countries had prolonged lockdowns, but it did not stop the spread of the virus. Given that cases are going up, what can we say about lockdowns and what role are variants playing in this reality?
Yo voy a empezar porque
I will begin to answer this because in Brazil, we have a lot of difficulties with the issue of lockdowns. And what we did during lockdown in the country, and strictly speaking, as was seen, for example, in China at the beginning of the infection, what is important is there are a few things that are important for this to have an impact. And the strategy for lockdown, one thing is that a country of the size of Brazil, if you don't follow the lockdown in a coordinated way, well done amongst all states, the spread of the virus continues. It can come down in one region, but if in another region, the lockdown is not done, or if you do it at a different time, then this will not prevent the virus from circulating and from the people to be circulating and being infected. It's important to say that when we speak of virus circulation, what we're talking is about the circulation of people, because the people are those that move around the virus in the spaces where they are. And something else is at the time, because we know that a person can have no symptoms, can continue to be asymptomatic, or can show symptoms, or have the disease and show symptoms of 15 days later. It could be up to 15 days, according to the mean, after being infected. So you have a lockdown of 1 week. If you have a lockdown of 10 days, which is a lot, but it doesn't cover the whole time in which a virus is in the person without the clinical manifestation, the clinical signs. So then this will not work out. So what we saw in the countries is that you have the lockdown, but not during the sufficient time so that all cases will be isolated, or it is not done in a coordinated way in which the entire region will be isolated. So what happens is that there's always a virus that escapes, a circulation of the virus that escapes. So it is not effective. What we see, and this is what we're seeing in Brazil, we see peaks in one region or another one, then we see a decrease, but then it goes up again. So that is a situation that is quite different, and it must be treated specifically region by region, country by country, state by state, coordinating actions, time, and the moment of acting. One additional comment to what was just said by Fernando, and I fully agree with him. The lockdown is only one more tool together with all the other control measures. And currently, I believe that more than ever, It is in the hands of society. It is up to each individual, the one who's responsible for all of this, that the individual is responsible for following the measures of the mask, distancing to avoid crowds and avoid massive events. All these things together with things such as the lockdown is what could give good results. But in a very unequal way, as Fernando was saying, it will definitely not be what will bring us out of this. Thank you. Thank you both for having been connected today. We should be closing today's session. We've received a lot of questions and queries, and we've covered different aspects of the variants, and we hope that this has been extremely useful. But to conclude, I wanted to ask Fernando and Jairo, what is your last message or the recommendation that you'd like our journalists to take with them about what you said today? Fernando, what is your last message that you'd like to leave with us today?
De decir que tenemos que nos cuidar, mismo que tengamos vacunas, mismo que tengamos
I'd like to say we have to take care of ourselves. Even if we have the vaccine, we have to consider that even if the supplies of vaccine increases, that's not a passport for full freedom as we had in the past. So we do have to take care of ourselves, take into consideration that the vaccine is the strongest tool we have right now to fight against the virus, together with all the pharmacologic measures. So the laboratory measures, thanks to that, we have the vaccine, but we have to create a great deal of awareness because we're in the midst of this process. Thank you all, and thank you very much for this opportunity. Thank you, Fernando. Jairo, final words? I think that I'll follow the same line of Fernando's. And the truth is that I'd love to see the many questions that we have. We should have had another 2 hours so that we could have answered them all. And this is wonderful. I'm seeing all the concerns of all the people, and you can know that many of these concerns are concerns that we share with you because we're learning every day. And I think that this is part of the message, that this has not ended. As we said, we have to continue to take care of ourselves. The vaccine, any one of the vaccines, are just another tool to help us in the public health control, but it's all our responsibilities. We have to take care of ourselves. Let's not focus so much on the question of variants. We understand that from the scientific point of view or biological point of view, it's a passionate subject, but we have to focus more on other things, on the control measures, on what will really allow us to curb the transmission of the virus. Let's focus more on that. And let us definitely have as a key message that the control measures we have work, they continue to work regardless of the variants. So let's keep these, let's be strict with these, and definitely let's continue to take care of ourselves because this will continue. And thank you all very much for being with us this afternoon. Very well. Thank you very much, Fernando. Thank you very much, Jairo. And thank you all for connecting to this 2-hour seminar. And we hope that this has been helpful and that it will continue contribute to your coverage because we have to give the people quality-based information, evidence-based information, because we know that that can also help people make informed decisions and so that all of us together can put an end to this pandemic. Thank you all for connecting and continue to be in touch with us through our social networks and our webpage where we're constantly updating the information. Thank you again. Greetings, and let's continue to take care of ourselves.